Everyone to Colleagues and Conversations. We're really pleased to have you join us this evening with James Anderson to learn more about psychobiography and its relevance for psychotherapy. First, I have a few housekeeping announcements. Dr. Anderson is happy to field questions during his talk. He'll call your attention, particularly at moments when he will invite response. You can do that in one of several ways. You're welcome to unmute yourself and sing out. There is a way in the Zoom platform down at the bottom on the button that says react. You can press that button and recognize hand gestures and indicate a waving hand electronically, and Jim can see you and call on you. Failing that, you can also post a question in the chat anytime, and I will be happy to keep track of those questions. I want to tell you about a couple of books as we get started here. The first is one that we at Yellowbrick are particularly proud of, called Minding the Brain, a developmental neurobiological approach to intensive treatment of young adults. It looks like this. This is a compendium of Yellowbrick's wisdom and experience over the past 20 years, almost 20. I think I have that right. Scholarly articles, clinically rich, detailed descriptions of the work that we do at Yellowbrick with emerging adults and their families. There's really nothing like it, I think, in the field. Speaking of a book that is overdue and offers really nothing like what's come before it, this is an edited book by Doris Bertacci, Chris Deeg, and Linda Mayers on the Handbook on the Clinical Treatment of Adopted Adolescents and Young Adults. And the cover looks like this. You can see as I'm holding up. We are particularly pleased to spread the word of the excellence and insights collected in Doris's edited work on an in-depth psychological and developmentally informed and sensitive approach to working with really all members of the adoption system, but most particularly the adopted adolescent and young adult, with, I think, sophisticated attention paid to the unique developmental challenges and issues that adopted young people face. So,
thank you, Jen. Thank you, Bryn.
You're very welcome. Last housekeeping announcement, it's best in the meantime to turn off your microphone. So please mute, and any ambient sounds on your end will not be a distraction for the presentation. So James Anderson is professor of clinical psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Northwestern University. There, he teaches courses on personality psychology and the psychology of film. He also serves on the faculty of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute and has been conducting psychoanalytic psychotherapy for several decades. He received degrees from Princeton, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. And in his research, he focuses on psychobiography and has published pieces on William and Henry James, Abraham Lincoln, Edith Wharton, Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, D.W. Winnicott, Woodrow Wilson, and Frank Lloyd Wright. And if that doesn't pique your interest, let me just tell you that in his terrific new book, Psychobiography in Search of the Inner Life, published by Oxford University Press, 2024, Dr. Anderson observes that biographies are at their best when they present their subject as a three-dimensional human being who possesses an inner life. Psychobiography in Search of the Inner Life also offers tools for using psychological approaches when writing biography. Dr. Anderson recommends using psychology to open up, not close down, to provide new questions and not just easy answers, really to complicate and not simplify. His lively inquiry into the art of biography, with its vignettes about people such as Oprah Winfrey, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Henry James, Simone de Beauvoir, Edith Wharton, and Anais Nin, it's bound to appeal to all of you who are curious about the lives of fascinating persons. And I would add, to all of us who endeavor to help our clients know and better understand themselves. Please welcome Dr. James Anderson.
Well, thank you, Bryn, for that lovely introduction. I appreciate that very much. As you mentioned, my topic is what is psychobiography and how is it relevant to psychotherapy? Now, how did I come up with this topic? Well, I've observed that religious groups, as an example, can have talks about anything as long as the topic is related to the group. And I feel that also extends to other kinds of groups, that you can have a talk about just about anything as long as it's relevant to the group. So for a religious group, for example, you can have a talk on tax cuts and their relevance to Catholics, or the current mayoral election and its relevant to the Presbyterians, or elephants and their relevance to the Jews. I recently published my book on psychobiography and wanted to talk about it. I realize I'm talking to an audience of mostly psychotherapists and other professionals who work with psychiatric patients. And so I came up with my topic of relating psychobiography to psychotherapy. Now, as background, I'll describe how I became interested in psychoanalytic psychology and psychobiography. It was not from taking psychology courses when I was an undergraduate. The only psychology course I took as an undergraduate was the 2-semester course on experimental psychology. I took it only because there was a science requirement, and the course seemed to me to be the least sciencey course that qualified for the science requirement. The other alternative would have been to take a geology course that was nicknamed Rocks for Jocks. The course I took was aptly nicknamed rat psychology, because we mostly learned about the psychology of rats, unfortunately, instead of about the psychology of human beings. The course included a laboratory, and each pair of lab partners was issued a rat and a box. And we learned how thoroughly we could control those poor, vulnerable animals with food pellets and electric shock. The psychologist Deborah Lupnitz, whom some of you may have heard of, is a friend of mine. She's best known because she wrote what I consider to be the best book on psychotherapy cases, a book that's written both for professionals and for general readers. It's the kind of book I might recommend for a new patient in psychotherapy to get some sense about what psychotherapy is like. The book has been a great success despite a title that you'd think would put off just about anyone. The title is Schopenhauer's Porcupines. Why put an obscure German philosopher with a hard to pronounce name in your title? I think that was a mistake, but the book has done well anyway. So why did I bring up Deborah? I brought up Deborah because she told me that she had the same experiences I did with a rat psychology course when she was an undergraduate. I paraphrase her comment to me. She said to me, "You took the course in order to look deeply into the human psyche, and instead you found yourself face to snout with a rat." The professor of my course asserted, not as a ridiculous joke, but in all seriousness, that it was best for us to view the mind as a black box. In other words, it didn't matter what went on in the box. All that mattered was that various stimuli came in, such as feeding the food rat pellets, feeling the rat food pellets when it pushed the bar in this box, and various behaviors came out, such as the rat frequently pushing the bar so as to get more food pellets. And the idea was it simply didn't matter what went on in the rat's mind. The professor's comment shocked me then, and I still regard it as a perversion of psychology, which should be primarily the study, not the ignoring of the mind. At about the same time as I was enduring that myopic course, I first came across Tolstoy's Anna Karenina in a course on Russian literature. Tolstoy's amazing insights into his characters compares to the bankrupt psychology course as holding a flower in one's hand and looking at its loveliness and taking in its fragrance compares to viewing a blurry black and white photo of a flower. I also had an interest in India because I'd spent the summer before my senior high school in India through the program American Field Service. Some of you may have heard of that program over the years. It's still going today. It was quite popular, I think, though, when I was in high school. Anyway, I spent the summer in India, which gave me a great interest in that amazing country. And when I heard of a much exclaimed book by Erik Erikson, Gandhi's Truth, I read it and was entranced. This was the kind of psychology that Tolstoy used, as did other psychologically acute authors such as Shakespeare and Philip Roth and Edith Wharton. I had been thinking of becoming a historian. After I read Gandhi's Truth, I had a new idea to become a psychohistorian and a psychobiographer. That would be a way of distinguishing myself from other historians. At first, I thought of studying history and doing psychology on the side. But as I learned more about psychology, I decided to become a psychologist and to do history on the side, especially because I realized that becoming a psychologist would also give me a chance to conduct psychotherapy. And that, of course, has gone on to be my main work over the years and has really overtaken me in terms of my interests. William James, the great psychologist, pioneer of psychology, once commented that it seemed ridiculous that a young, immature person decides on a career, and decades later, that person is often stuck with it. He has a striking quote about all the parts of oneself that might develop at that time, but are murdered by that decision. You could go off in another direction, but you go off in one particular direction that cuts off so many other possibilities. But my experience was anything but gruesome. I was captured by an interest as a young man, and the fire of that interest burns as brightly today as it ever has. Now, my title states that I will define psychobiography. I said, what is psychobiography? Well, there isn't really much to say. Psychobiography refers to the study using psychological perspectives of the lives of notable figures in history, politics, intellectual life, the arts, and other fields. The value of this form of study should be obvious. We're all interested in these people of achievement. We'd like to know about them and what makes them tick. Psychology is necessary for accomplishing that purpose. Now, I will go on to discuss 4 aspects of psychobiography and how they are relevant to psychotherapy, to working with psychiatric patients, psychological patients, counseling patients. Let me note that for years, I organized talks at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute and the Chicago Psychoanalytic Society. I organized well over 300 talks. I was about to say to Bryn, I recommend that you wait until 5 after to start the meeting. Turned out that's exactly what he did, but that was also what I developed over all that time of conducting those meetings at the Psychoanalytic Institute. So as I say, I organized well over 300 talks. If you find me boring, I have no excuse. I should have learned what it takes to give an engaging presentation. And in fact, I did learn one key lesson. If a speaker talks on and on, the audience is almost certain to become bored. That's where that famous phrase about talking heads comes from. So here's what I'm going to do. After each of these 4 parts of my presentation, these 4 fairly brief discussions I'll make of these 4 different topics, I'll ask you, the audience, for questions and comments. And I would ask you all to do us a favor and be thinking in the back of your mind of some things you'd like to comment on or ask a question about or give an opinion about so that we can enliven our meeting by having a lot of interaction between all of us rather than my just droning on and on. Okay, my first topic of the four is narrative identity. A chapter of my book focuses on this topic. Narrative identity refers to the story about oneself that a person creates, a story that reflects how the person sees himself or herself. When people make up stories about themselves, they're also revealing their identity and how they see themselves and maybe how they'd like you to see them. Now, you can glean aspects of how I see myself from the story I told you about my initial involvement with psychotherapy. You can interpret that I have a vision of myself as a psychobiographer, that I see myself as someone who isn't hesitate to criticize others. I was pretty harsh on that professor with his experimental psychology course. You can see that I view myself as someone, mm, mm, you could that I sort of view my life as a heroic adventure, that I came up with this idea and I followed it all these years. And you might think that's inaccurate and blowing up and exaggerated. And maybe it is, but that would be telling you something about me. Oh, I can't avoid telling you this little anecdote. I recently came across all of these anecdotes I had from when my son, who's now in his 30s, was like 8 years old. And I'm going to tell you two of these little anecdotes from my son from the age of 8, because I'm only able to do this because one of them doesn't make me look very good, but it's probably quite accurate. And then the other one makes me look good. So I'm not too embarrassed to tell you the first one as long as I tell you the second one. So the first one, my son said, Dad thinks he's special. He is special, but he's not as special as he thinks he is. And you can more or less see that that fits with that story I told about the heroic adventure of how I became interested in psychobiography. And then the other one that makes me look good, so I don't hesitate talking about this one. It was a Saturday, and his mother said to him, "Oh, how would you like to have a play date today?" He said, "Why would I want a play date when Daddy's home?" So um, let me go on. And so I want, as in my examples, these stories that people tell related to narrative identity are close to what we would call objective truth, perhaps. Well, I'm saying they are not this at all the same thing as objective truth. They reflect a person's view of themselves. There's perhaps some elements of truth in it, but we don't take these stories as gospel truth. But if we want to understand a person in doing psychobiography, you can see why this would be one of the most important things to know about someone. How do they depict themselves through the stories they tell? Now, I'll give an example from the book. It's based on the preeminent psychobiographer Leon Adele's analysis of the great novelist Ernest Hemingway. Adele points out that Hemingway was the poster boy for hypermasculinity. Adele wrote, he liked to shoot, to fish, to drink. We know that he was boastful. He wanted to fight wars and shoot big game and catch the biggest fish and live the manliest life, unquote. Seeking to understand Hemingway better, a well-known journalist named Max Eastman, well-known in those days, not today, he asked the question in print, why did Hemingway seem to care so much about the hair on his chest? And then Eastman went on to imply that Hemingway had false hair on his chest, that all of this bragging was like a toupee that somebody might wear uh, on their chest with false hair, that Hemingway really wasn't all of what he tried to depict himself as being. Pretty nasty on Eastman's part, but it may have been true. In other words, he was saying Hemingway wasn't the E-man he claimed to be when he was proclaiming that he was the toughest and the best. Well, as you could imagine, Hemingway was incensed at Eastman's analysis of him. And it so happened that a year or so after this was in print, he happened to run into Eastman at the office of the editor, whom both of them shared. After confronting Eastman about the article, Hemingway hit him in the face with a book. I guess that was the handiest weapon available in the editor's office. I guess he was lucky there wasn't a big stapler around, or it might have been worse. Anyway, reportedly, then the novelist opened his shirt to show his chest hair, and then he ripped open Eastman's shirt to reveal how much or little hair Eastman had on his chest. If I were really trying to get everybody's attention, I'd open up my shirt at this point and show off my chest. But no, you don't need to hurry up and turn off your video. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. Adele argued that Hemingway's huge reaction to Eastman's criticism implies that the novelist's bravado covered over a deeper view of himself as someone who feared being seen as weak and cowardly and inadequate. Actually, yeah, Hemingway had a kind of similar view. I'm sorry, Adele had a kind of similar view of Hemingway as did Eastman. So I've given you the basics of narrative identity. And now any of you could answer this, my next question, but I'm going to answer it myself. How does narrative identity relate to psychotherapy? I think it's pretty clear that it's a useful concept to have in doing psychotherapy. We can listen to the patient's narrative identity, both the outer identity, similar to Hemingway's depiction of his masculinity, and something deeper, something that the identity may be concealing. So I'm making that argument that this is a useful tool for psychotherapists. Gosh, I use the word tool there. I don't really like that term, excuse me, in relation to psychotherapy, but I guess it kind of relates here. Now, as an example, I'll mention that a time I heard from a supervisee about a patient who told of how she continually deferred to others. If she got an undesirable seat in a restaurant, she avoided making any complaints, although she knew that others would speak up in that situation. This patient noted that her lovers consistently said how easy she was to get along with. So we see the narrative identity of a woman who deferred to others and who didn't feel she deserved to ask for the best for herself. But it also came out that there was another side of her. Anger constantly boiled away within her as she felt that others took advantage of her. And when she told these stories, you could see the anger about what happened, like in a restaurant and being given a poor seat. So we might say there were two kinds of identity within her. On the outside, she was meek and deferential. That aspect of her interacted with an inner view of being an angry person who experienced herself as being cheated constantly. Okay, so now the challenge is in your court. We have some time for questions and comments, and I love to hear what you might say. And it could be a question for me, or it could be a comment that you just wanted to make as you hear about this. For example, it might remind you of something with a patient you've worked with.
So, Jim, it seems to me that the challenge for the psychobiographer or the biographer in general is not so dissimilar from the challenge that psychotherapists face, which is how to contextualize or evaluate the self-presentation of the person you're observing or studying. When a person shares an anecdote, for example, that leaves us with the sense that there's more to the surface, there's more to the anecdote and the person than just the surface moral that the anecdote seems to leave us with. Um, it seems to me that the biographer, like the therapist, has to be working at least a couple of different levels, if not multiple levels at the same time.
Oh, that couldn't be said better. Absolutely right. Yes, it's almost the basic point of my whole book that you get the surface presentation, and there's some very poor biographies that are all, depiction of the surface presentation, but you don't capture the biographical subject unless you get underneath that, unless you find a way to get inside. In fact, I finally have a chance, I've been looking for it, to hold up my book. And it's called Psychobiography in Search of the Inner Self. And that's exactly what we're talking about, in getting in search of the inner self. So yes, that was perfect. Uh, and in psychotherapy, the same thing. The person brings a kind of surface depiction to us, but there is the inner person that we're trying to get at and understand, and in fact, help the patient understand herself or himself better too. So there is that direct parallel. And I
So,
see
so,
Jesse raising his hand.
so Jim, the psychobiographer or the psychotherapist is within a co-experienced relationship of the narrative, is actually creating their own parallel narrative about what may be lurking beneath the explicit narrative. In today's world, it's become somewhat commonplace to have people in the mental health field begin to speak of those narratives about public figures, particularly political figures. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about how to think through and navigate our creating narratives about public figures, especially political figures, both in our public life as well as in the consulting room, as patients bring us, these, experiences themselves, especially in relationship to the Goldwater rule. Do you have some thoughts about that? Sorry for such a complicated question.
Well, there are really two key points that you brought up. So the first one is how the therapist and the patient co-create a narrative. And that's the great advantage of psychotherapy, that we have the patient co-creating it with us, whereas in biography, the biographer has to create it on one's own. Although there are those rare exceptions when one does a biography of somebody who's alive and is able to interview that person in depth, and some amazing works can come out of that, like the biography of Steve Jobs, Walter Jacobson. That's the wrong name. What's his name again? The biographer of Steve. I probably have the book here. I got him mixed up with the TV commentator. That's funny. Isaacson. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I was close. I got Jacobson instead of Isaacson. And now all we need is Abrahamson. But anyway, yeah, so there are some biographies like that. And in that case, Isaacson was able to interview Steve Jobs in detail, and that was a rare exception. Okay, but the main question you had to do with the Goldwater rule. So it's worth my saying a little bit about that. The Goldwater rule came about in this way. When Goldwater was running for president against Lyndon Johnson, he was disliked by a lot of people. As we look back, he wasn't really a horrible guy by any means. And they did a poll, some magazine or journal did a poll of psychiatrists and asked about whether he was mentally fit to be president. And a lot of these psychiatrists said no. And this was then highly criticized and justly. I mean, what did they know about that? They didn't have enough knowledge of him to be able to answer that question. And also to say he was mentally unfit, psychiatrically unfit. They had never met him in person. They had never interviewed him. They had no real basis for a diagnosis. And then you might say that the psychiatric profession overreacted to this. And they said, oh my God, no, no, no. Psychiatrists should never be allowed to make these kinds of comments and analysis of public figures. And I call that an overreaction because it doesn't mean that a psychiatrist who is very knowledgeable and studies somebody in depth doesn't have something to tell us about that person. And it cuts off information that we, the voters, and we, the citizens, ought to have about public figures from people who are knowledgeable and who really study them in depth. And by the way, however, as I say, the psychiatric profession made the Goldwater rule, and they said it was disallowed for psychiatrists to make these kind of diagnostic analyses or psychobiographies of public figures. But that I will note that doesn't apply to psychologists and other people in the mental health field. That was a particular idea of the psychiatric profession. So in summary, my view is it is legitimate to do psychological analysis of public figures, and it provides a valuable service. And people have to use that like anything else. I mean, the economist can do an analysis of a candidate's economic program, and it carries a certain weight because it's done by an economist. But at the same time, people don't have to accept everything about that at face value. And another economist can come in and say, well, I don't really agree with that, and here's why. And the same thing I think is true in the psychological field. So that's my comment about this. Of course, there is something here I'm not saying, and I don't think I'm going to go into it, but because of President Trump and some of the, how shall I put it? Some of the difficulties in his personality, even his strongest supporters would agree that there are difficulties in his personality. This subject has become especially one of interest in recent years. But I don't think I would really go into saying more about Trump. I guess if somebody really wants to push it, we could, but I'm mostly thinking that this is a subject I wouldn't emphasize. I actually do say a bit about him in the introduction to my book, but I'll leave that aside for now. Okay.
Thanks, Jim.
If we could have one more question or comment, if anyone has one, and then I'll go on and you'll have more opportunities later. Anybody have anything right now they'd like to bring up? Okay. Okay, now we've got the professionals, Bryn in charge of the meeting, Jesse being the executive of Yellow Brick. So you other foot soldiers, I'm counting on you to get involved and not just to have them ask some questions. Okay, let's see where I am. My next comment, my next area of discussion is artistic creation. As I was thinking over my remarks on this topic, it struck me that it's closely related to my first topic of narrative identity. I'll begin by making a declaration that I've never seen anyone say before, but probably someone has. A human being is an animal that makes up stories. The foremost exemplar of that saying is the novelist, of course. Novelists and other writers of fiction, all artists in fact, draw on that which haunts, obsesses, troubles, and moves them. Their concerns, conflicts, and preoccupations fuel their works. But note that all of us tell stories when we narrate the experiences we have. And don't forget dreams. All of us dreams. And the dreams we have are stories that we create. So creating stories is very central to who we are as human beings. In my book, I have a chapter in which I examine the psychobiography of creative artists. My main illustrations are Arthur Miller and the play The Crucible, and Edith Wharton and her novella Ethan Frome. I also consider Wharton's novel The Age of Innocence, and I recommend the novel and also the movie of the novel if you haven't seen it, which is directed by Martin Scorsese, The Age of Innocence. One theme I saw with Wharton is that her way of seeing life and coping with challenges is reflected in her fiction, but also her dreams. So this is the basic point I'm making here, that both in the stories we create and in dreams that we have, our basic underlying concerns, preoccupations, conflicts, all of that feeds those stories. And as I say with Wharton, both her fiction and her dreams reflect her inner world. And I'll share with you a dream of Wharton's from late in the year 1913 when she was 51 years old. So this is her dream. A pale demon with black hair came into the room, followed by 4 gnome-like creatures carrying a great black trunk. They set it down and opened it. And the demon, after crying out, "Here's your year. Here are all the horrors that have happened to you and that are still going to happen." The demon dragged out a succession of limp, black, squirming things and drew them on the floor before me. Now, if I really wanted to make a talk like this great, I would somehow have somebody create a cartoon depiction of this dream. But you can picture that in your mind, this demon with the trunk and bringing these ugly black things out of the trunk and saying, "This represents your year, all that's happened and all that's still going to happen in the months left in the year." She goes on to describe the dream as follows. They were not rags or creatures, not living or dead. They were black horrors, shapeless, and that seemed to writhe about as they fell at my feet. And yet they were as inanimate as bits of stuff. But I knew what they were. They were the hideous, the incredible things that happened to me in this dreadful year, or were to help happen to me before its close. And I stared, horror-struck, as the demon dragged them out one by one, more and more, till finally, flinging down a blacker, hateful one, he said, laughing, "There, that's the last of them." As I stared at the great black pile and the empty trunk, I said to the demon, "Are you sure it hasn't a false bottom?" I love her statement. I have to say, I love that statement. In her dream yet. Okay, now let's go back and understand this dream a little more. Wharton had been having a horrible year. In that year, she had a bitter falling out with her brother Henry Jones, the only relation with whom she'd been on good terms. There was a breach later repaired with the novelist Henry James, who was her most valued literary friend. Her relationship with her husband, Teddy Warren, had reached a breaking point. Not only was he cheating on her, but he plundered from her personal savings, and he was fiercely contesting her attempt to get a divorce. But during all the years from childhood on, she had demonstrated a particular stance toward the travails of life. She expected the worst, but felt that whatever was thrown at her, she could persist. And we can see that in this dream, she's using that same defense mechanism, that same, I don't like the term defense mechanism there. Let's say that same way of coping, which had served her well in her life, that she is able to absorb all of these awful things and say, all right, you've thrown all that stuff at me. If you've got anything else, I can handle it too. And that was sort of the meaning of saying, don't you think the trunk might have a false bottom? Like, yeah, you threw all this stuff at me. You think I'm overwhelmed, buddy? Well, there's probably more there, and I can handle that too. So we get an amazing example here of how the dream tells us so much about her and her personality and her way of coping and her way of experiencing life. And now I come to the second part of each of this topic, as with the others, which is what is the application to psychotherapy? And they're really sort of two. The obvious one, which I'm not going to say anything much about, is all of our patients dream. And I'm a great supporter of the value of the interpretation of dreams. And they tell us so much about the inner world of our patients. And it's an incredible opportunity we have as psychotherapists that these dreams are available. I sometimes feel when I make comments like this, gosh, I'm not really taking as much advantage of this as I should. And I try to use it as a reminder for myself that when I start seeing some more patients tomorrow, maybe I should keep this in mind and should remind the people from time to time, yeah, it's about time to hear another dream or pay some more attention to your dreams. Then the other application to therapy is if we have a patient who writes fiction or creates other kinds of art, that this would give us insight into the patient's view of the patient's way of experience of the world. Like, for example, I had one patient who wrote novels and short stories, and there was one short story that depicted the protagonist going to see an inscrutable psychotherapist. And the scene told me something I had not observed in sessions about how he saw me, that maybe he felt that I wasn't revealing who I was as well as I might have that would have been optimal for him as a patient. So I learned something very specific there about therapy. But of course, there are all kinds of other things you would learn from the fiction of a patient, the stories that a patient writes. And I had another favorite example. I had a patient who was an artist. And when she showed me this recent self-portrait, very fine artist, I must say, who sold art even. And she showed me this recent self-portrait. And I looked at it and I thought, she looks so depressed. And it sort of came out in our discussion that she was more depressed than she was revealing, that somehow her outer facade, as we were talking about Bryn before, that she presented to me was hiding her depression pretty well. And much of her talking was hiding it pretty well, but it came out in her self-portrait. And this clued me in to what was going on in her mind and helped us get deeper about some of the concerns and problems that were feeling pretty overwhelming to her at that time. So now we've come to our second period of discussion. And again, there's anything you can ask me about here or any kind of comment you might make. But I'd especially like to ask if any of you have worked with writers or painters or other artists and have had any experiences along these ways, along these lines, or have any of you done art therapy where you have patients do art as part of their treatment, and you find that as a useful tool for you and the patient understanding the patient. So Yes, Melinda. Now,
So
Melinda,
this,
before you go on, I just have to say I grew up in Shaker Heights, a suburb of Cleveland. Have you ever had relatives there? Because I had a good friend from
yeah.
childhood on named Dworkin.
Oh, actually, their names weren't working.
Oh, but you had other relatives
Big
there.
family I have there, yeah. And
Well, that's a weird
well known.
react comment, but okay, too bad you didn't know the Shaker Heights Dworkins, because yeah, I was very fond of them. But go on.
I was going to ask you, what do you make of these blobs that she saw that weren't human, were somewhat human and somewhat not, as representing her problems of the year or the issues?
Boy, I've never really thought about that. You have any thoughts about it before I make some my wild speculation?
Well, so the parts of it that was human, we understand. The parts that aren't human, is that her way of distancing herself from her issues?
Uh, Well, these blobs were just like these awful creatures, like you might
Yeah,
creature type somethings
buzz or
that you
something.
might see in a horror movie. So they
Yeah.
represented awfulness, fear, disgustingness, and so on. And that's
The
all I could
humanness of
see.
it is kind of taken out of it, right? The
But
humanness of it is there, it's kind of like they're dead already.
could there be some
The soul
sense
is gone already.
that what she's really afraid of is the evil in humans, but she's trying to distance herself from that. That what really upsets her are things like her husband's bad behavior and how evil he came to seem to her after they'd had a fairly okay relationship in the early years, but had really deteriorated and he'd
Lack
really
of,
deteriorated.
yeah, a lack of empathy that he showed her, right?
Well, that was definitely true of that relationship. Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Um,
And the thing that you said about Hemingway, how it was so important for him to have all this hair on his chest, or for someone to question, to have that they shouldn't question his masculinity. It's interesting because he died when he was in his 60s, when I imagine he felt a loosening of his masculinity, when men tend to start to feel more maternal.
hmm.
How big of an issue was that for him when he had to show his hair and compete with the other man? And how much did that stay with him? I mean, it's reflected in his writings, of course, but no one ever really did understand why he specifically committed suicide at 60. And it just made me think about the fact that, was he really able to cope with feeling less masculinity as he saw it, when in fact he's showing you just how hard it was for him to have someone suggest his hair on his chest wasn't authentic.
Yeah, okay, that's true. That he was no longer the man he once was, just as the man without hair on his chest wasn't the man he claimed to be. I can see your point. I actually just read something. I don't remember why this came up exactly about Hemingway's suicide and what was behind it. And it fits pretty well with what you said, that two of the things he was proudest of was being Mr. Manly Man, and secondly, his intelligence and writing ability and perceptiveness. And he had a serious mental deterioration also, perhaps something like an early onset of Alzheimer's or early senility or something like that. I don't remember what they think it was, or maybe it was something more specific. And so he lost those two areas that were so central to his pride in himself, both his writing ability and thinking ability and his masculinity. So it's really thought that's why he committed. That's the thought, and he tried to commit suicide more than once before he was successful. and made a lot of declarations about how he didn't want to live. And it wasn't like I'm temporarily in a depression and I want to end my life, but rather I really hate where I am in life and don't want to go on.
Well, he couldn't hold his liquor as well. And of course, that
Uh,
affected his thinking. But, you know, in a sense, he showed this bit of borderline self for him to get so attached to his chest hair and then to start having losses as he becomes, you know, older. You know, in a sense, it started to reflect some borderline, you know, the multiple suicides. But, you know,
yes.
also thinking that the narrative identity, you know, that really comes into play with family therapy when you have older children, adult children. It's probably one of the hardest things to navigate through is how everybody sees themselves and sees the other.
And there would be, I never thought of this before, but there would be the depiction of the family. And I would imagine each person in the family would have a somewhat different but related narrative identity for the family. Like somebody might say, "Oh, we were always a one happy family when the kids were young and we got along well." And maybe one of the kids would have a view, "I was always being told what to do and criticized and yelled at." And in our family, and that's what our family was like, a bunch of two angry parents with these intimidated children. So you'd get different narrative identities for a family. Huh.
And if you
Did I
just focus on the narrative identities, trying to get everybody to understand each other's identity and maybe to understand how the identity that they give to that person is in conflict, I mean, you probably could get somewhere because that seems to be the biggest problem where, you know, the finger pointing and also feeling as though they're not respected.
Yes, okay, all great points.
Yeah.
Anybody else like to bring something up? We would have time for another question or comment before we go on. Bryn is muted.
Sorry, I have one thought that keeps coming to mind as you talk about the creations of artists, whether dreams or self-representations, which is, it brings to mind a quote I once read in an essay by Philip Roth on the plight of the American novelist, which is that, as he writes about it, truth is stranger than fiction. You know, whatever the contemporary American novelist can make up, it pales in comparison to what's actually going on in everyday life. And he cites some extraordinary true story, you know, and goes on and on and on about that. But it strikes me that we still have to wrestle with all of the defensive edits that people inevitably make about how they experience themselves, how they portray themselves to others, and the narrative stories that they tell others and themselves. And it's incumbent on us to, I guess, hold a kind of skepticism alongside our empathy and, you know, acceptance of people to meet them where they are. Um, that we have to hold a kind of skepticism and appreciate that the reality is more complex than anything else. And I think the Edith Wharton dream might illustrate that um, in so far as she, in a way that, you know, reflects her own creative imagination, you know, with the demon who brings in the trunk and unpacks the trunk and these horrible black writhing creatures. And she vividly portrays the, you know, appalling disgust and, you know, angst that she feels about certain things going on in her life. But it's also true what Melinda, you were saying, which is that, she describes each and every one of these events as a kind of contained, admittedly horrible, but contained blob. And at the end, she tosses off an almost, witty, sardonic repartee in the midst of what would otherwise surely be a nightmare, where she kind of says, really, is that all you got? So anyway, reality more complex than what we have at face value.
Yes, you're very much in tune with me and my way of approaching these things, Bren. Absolutely. Your other question and this one are along the same lines, and that's exactly how I think. And in a way, that's I said before it was the underlying theme of the book, and in a way, it's the underlying theme of this talk. That these strategies that we use in psychobiography are similar to strategies we use in psychotherapy to get deeper. So looking at the narrative identity helps us understand the person, but at the same time, we don't take everything at face value. We know it's not all true. We know that there are reasons why somebody depicts themselves in a certain way, like Hemingway depicting himself as this he-man when that wasn't all accurate. And it's a little bit like the famous phrase of listening with the third ear, that we listen to the story with two of our ears, but we have a third ear that's also listening to what's underneath the story. And if that was what people took away from this evening, I would feel this was a great success. And I'm sure it fits in with how you approach patients anyway, but the idea is for this to reinforce that approach that you would be taking. Okay, so we're on to number 3 of 4. So the third area is using psychological theory. If one thinks about it, there is no psychobiography without psychological theory. What else does looking at a life through a psychological lens mean other than examining the person with the use of psychological theory? Now, here's one of my favorite quotations about psychobiography, an attack on it by political commentator George Will. He wrote, "In psychobiography, the large deeds of great individuals are explained with reference to some hitherto unsuspected sexual inclination or incapacity, which in turn is so-called explained by some slight the individual suffered at a tender age, say 7, when his mother took away a lollipop." So that's his attack on psychobiography. He's saying that psychobiographers make reductionistic interpretations. And sometimes they do. And I'll give an example. I mentioned my interest in India and Gandhi before. Well, a political scientist named Victor Wolfenstein wrote about Gandhi, the Indian independence leader. He observed that Gandhi had a stormy adolescence, and he concluded that Gandhi had had an identity crisis. In other words, Wolfenstein applied Erikson's well-known concept to Gandhi, right? Erikson developed this concept of the identity crisis. Everybody's heard of that concept, but it was a new concept developed by Erikson quite some years ago. And then Robert Coles, another person interested in these areas, criticized Wolfenstein's work. And he says that the way Wolfenstein used theory stops him dead. What does this conclusion really do for us to say Gandhi had an identity crisis? It really doesn't do anything. It just gives a label and then we're stuck there. Instead, it would be better to use Erikson's theorizing about identity formation to raise various questions. For example, was Gandhi's identity similar to his father's? Or was his identity in revolt against his father's identity? Actually, one could find that both apply. Another question would be, how did others react to Gandhi's identity? And so I write the following about the use of theory in my book. I write theory. I think this was pretty much quoted already by Bryn at the beginning, but I'll read it again. Theory should open up, not close down. Provide new questions, not easy answers. Complicate, not simplify. Produce possibilities, not reductions. In psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, theory, I argue, should be used in the same way. And I think I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to go on to number, since that was rather brief, but you might have thoughts about that, and we'll have some time about the use of theory and how we can use theory to open things up and not close down. It's like saying, I've got this person all figured out. He's got an Oedipus complex. But that doesn't really tell us very much. That should be the opening of trying to learn about the person, not something that stops us dead in our tracks or makes us think we know something when we really don't know very much. So I'm going to go on to my fourth topic, which in a way is the richest one. And yeah, we've got enough time for me to get through this and still have a little time for more discussion. And this topic is the relationship of psychobiographers with their subjects. And if you think about it, well, every psychobiographer gets very involved with the person you're writing about. You love or hate the person, you like or dislike, you feel close or distant, you relate them to yourself or not, you feel critical, all kinds of ways a biographer has a relationship with the subject. And of course, you can hear the undertone of what I'm saying, that every therapist has a relationship with the patient the therapist is working with. Now, I'll give you an example from the book of a psychobiographer and her relationship to her subject. So I'm drawing on Margot Duxler's fine psychobiography of the diarist Anais Nin. Some of you, most of you may have heard of her. She was once very popular. She wrote these spectacular diaries that are just fascinating. She also wrote some fiction, but nothing that made quite the impact of her diaries. And these diaries tell of her seemingly liberated lifestyle and when an audience, a particularly large audience during the period of the feminist movement of the late 60s and the 70s. In these diaries, Nin tells of her adventurous and sensational life, a life that included affairs with multiple people, including the novelist Henry Miller and the psychoanalyst Adorak. Now, Duxler, who goes on to write a psychobiography of her, came from what she saw as a conservative and boring milieu in suburban Chicago. She saw Nin as representing a much more compelling lifestyle. Duxler wrote, so here, and Duxler was 20 years old at this time and was really taken by these diaries. And she wrote a kind of fan letter to Nin. And to her surprise, Nin replied and invited her to come to a talk she was giving. And Duxler went to the talk and met her afterwards. And they ended up developing a friendship that lasted for 11 years with a lot of correspondence and quite a few meetings. And now I have this picture that I just love. I talked to Duxler. I'm going to risk. Okay, so first I hit share screen. Okay, where is that now? There, I see it. Share screen. Then I hit the picture, which should be there. No? Here it is. Share. Aha, that works.
There we go.
So I said she'd been friends. I said to Margot, whom I got to know, you've been friends with Nin for 11 years, and you probably have some pictures of the two of you together. And she said, "Oh my God, I can't find any of those pictures. The way I did have some pictures like this." And she looked and she looked. She said, "The only thing I can find is this contact sheet from a roll of pictures that were actually taken at the very time when she first met Nin." And I thought, oh, this is so good. Uh, and I put a lot of effort into enhancing and enlarging this picture so I could put it in my book. And so you see what it shows. This is the very first time she met Nin. And Nin is this great celebrity giving a book talk. And at the top, Nin is autographing her book for somebody. And you see Duxler in the background in the middle, looking on, kind of awestruck by this person she idealizes. And then in the bottom picture, you get a view of Nin with her lovely smile. And again, we see in the background Duxler. So I thought that was so much better than if she'd had just a regular picture of the two of them standing together, that I had this authentic picture from when she had first met Nin at Nin's book talk after she had written her this fan letter. So I'll leave that on the screen for a little bit. And I'm looking at my time. Okay, 7:12. I'm going to pay close attention to the time. After Nin's, yeah, right. So they had a friendship for 11 years. After Nin's death, Duxler, who had idealized Nin, became painfully disillusioned. Some volumes of Nin's original diaries were published, and Duxler learned how drastically Nin had misportrayed her life in the edited, expurgated versions that Duxler had read earlier. By the way, this is so similar to the point that Bryn made, that the stories that she told about herself, so to speak, in the edited diaries were misportraying her in ways that came out more accurately when the actual diaries that had what she actually wrote at the time were made available. So some of the things that Duxler saw is that Nin had made herself seem much more independent than she had been by concealing in the edited diaries that she'd been married and supported by her husband. Nin also hid the extent of her lying. And Duxler realized that Nin had lied to her too. As Duxler noted, Lynn told her, quote, that she, Nin, believed the soul of the child she had miscarried had been reborn in me. So in those diaries, there was the story about her very sad miscarriage. And then she told this young woman, the soul of that child has been inborn in me. Very, very powerful statement to make to a young woman who looks up to you and almost worships you. And so Duxler learned the hard lesson that it hadn't been a miscarriage, but actually it had been a 7-month abortion. And furthermore, that Nin had told several other young women that she perceived them to be the incarnation of that miscarried, so supposedly miscarried child. Okay. Yeah, Melinda, you can ask your question. Why not?
It's not a
You
question.
have,
I also
I'm
read.
sorry, your comment.
I also read all the diaries, and I mean, it's going back years, but she wrote the bell jar, and that's when she does talk about the abortion.
Well, we're getting a couple things mixed up because the bell jar is Sylvia Plath, so I'm not
Oh, I'm
sure.
sorry, it wasn't the bell jar. It was something that she wrote as a novel by another name that was about the abortion.
That gave out the abortion, but I guess the
Yeah.
unexpurgated diaries also described an abortion instead of a
Yeah.
miscarriage. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, we
Yes.
could
It was a pretty
now.
wild sexual diary or
I
diary.
see.
Henry
Oh,
James.
I'm tempted to get off on Sylvia Plath, but I'm going to control
Oh
myself
no,
because
I'm
that's
sorry. I don't know why I brought that up.
topic for
Maybe
biographers.
somebody here knows it, but it was called the Bell something. I'll have to look it up, but was a little book, and it was about that. But niacin, I guess what she's saying is that the creative mind sometimes speaks the way they experience or think of something as opposed to what we might see as the reality.
Well, and it was also a way
Reality.
she wanted to see people. She wanted the people to see her this way, and she wanted to see herself this way. So she rewrote the diaries along those lines. It's not, and she made them more fictional than they were. She had to be somewhat aware of that, but that's something someone might do. I don't begrudge her doing that, but I also can see how her biographer, her young friend, when she learned about this, felt really cheated and disillusioned to see that she'd had this ideal of what Nin was like, and it wasn't really accurate, and that Nin had lied to her. I mean, that would hurt. That lie about you're the one and only special person to me, and then she learns, oh yeah, she likes to tell that to young women who look up to her.
Yeah, but I think one gets from reading the diaries that she's a very dreamy person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she probably felt devoted to keeping her diaries very dreamy, very optimistic that way. But that's all in what you're talking about. It's how a person sees himself, and sometimes the imagination that the person brings to themselves is probably more reflective of their inner life than the facts are. So
Yes.
what is it that is really the biography?
Well, this is perfect for a biographer. If you have both the original diaries and then you have the fictionalized diaries, that's perfect for the biographer. They have both the real diaries and the fictionalized diaries because that gives you both sources of information. And the places where somebody changes things are especially meaningful. You can see how wonderful it is to be a biographer because of being able to delve into these things. But it's equally wonderful to be a psychotherapist. Even better, of course, because we get to delve into these things in a way that is therapeutically helpful for our patients. And there's nothing more interesting in the world than people in real life when they, especially when they open themselves up, as we hope our patients will be able to do, as we try to guide them to do.
And
Uh,
Niacin's audience, they were young women. I think if she had been, I'm thinking back to myself at 16, and if they had been reading about her husband, I mean, I don't even think I knew she was married.
Yeah, it probably was completely hidden that she was married during a lot of this time, yes, or
But
all of it.
I might have lost a lot of interest in her poetry and her stories.
Maybe so.
So, that's why I say, what is the identity of a person? Is it the facts as we know them, or, is it the inner world that sneaks through the life that we live? Who's the real person?
Well, we want to learn as much as we can about all the different, I think Bryn used the term dimensions, all the different dimensions of the person. So I'm going to hurry through because I do want to get to the end of what I'm saying about relationships, and I only have like half a page to go. And then we'll still have a little bit of time. Um, so here's the point I want to make. If Duxler had written a psychobiography of Nin while intoxicated by her and idealizing her, the resulting book would have been faulty. Similarly, if she had written a book imbued with her anger at and disappointment with Nin, that book also would have been inadequate. But instead, Duxler was able to use her feelings, similar to what we call countertransference, to understand Nin rather than to idealize her or condemn her. Duxler set out to examine why Nin acted as she did. Duxler used her own feelings to comprehend the effect Nin had on people. And she could also see the effect people had on Nin. For example, in her own case, she came to Duxler with admiration for her and looking to use her as a model of a modern and liberated, to use the word in vogue at the time, woman. Duxler could see how Nin's behavior was in part the result of how people like Duxler related to her. Most important in my view is that Duxler was sympathetic to Nin and liked and appreciated her. That position enabled her to empathize with Nin despite Duxler's recognition of how Nin had mistreated her. And all of what I've said here applies to our use of what we call our countertransference in psychotherapy, not idealizing or denigrating the patient, seeing how patients become who they are, and recognizing how our behavior affects the patient. But most important, in my view, is our being able to appreciate and feel caring and to like our patient. The takeaway I hope you have from my talk is that psychobiography, while certainly not revolutionizing our conduct of psychotherapy and analysis, can provide us with some useful guidelines. Okay, so we've got a little more than 5 minutes left for more comments and discussion. Certainly love to hear from some of you who haven't spoken up yet, but I'd also be glad to hear from Melinda or Bryn if they have more to say. How about you, Carol Lee? I thank you for keeping your picture on because it really helps me to see the picture of a few people. And I have some idea if people are hearing me and you have a way of paying attention that is real, that I felt like you were hearing what I was saying. Would you like to say something? You have to unmute yourself, even if you only unmute yourself to say, no, I don't want to say anything.
No, I really don't want to say anything right now. I'm taking it all in.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you for attending. Well, okay. So let me just make a final comment and then I think we can stop. Enjoyed having the chance to talk about this with you. I felt I really did enjoy the exchanges that we had. They were so relevant to what I was talking about and so on target. And I hope this was useful to some of you in your work with your patients and people that you work with, and especially with the idea of how multidimensional people are, how much there is to them, how are the ways they depict themselves, what they show, and there's that incredible inner life to every patient we work with. I will mention a side thing, yes. Just give me 1 second here. One of the great psychologists of the last 50 years is Irwin Yalom. And one of the things, and most or all of you have probably heard of him. He's very influential, written, I don't know, 20 books or something like that. And my son lives in Palo Alto, and I heard that Yalom still lives in Palo Alto. So I thought, here's a chance to meet him.
No, he's actually deceased now.
No, he isn't, unless he died in the last couple of days.
Not in the last couple days, but I thought he had
I saw
died.
him 2 weeks ago.
Oh my gosh.
93 years old.
I'm mistaken then. I know
You might
his
have
wife
read about
had,
his wife dying. There was some
I did
stuff
read about that.
And they had written a book together after she was ill about facing death. So you might have heard about that. So anyway, so I thought I had some connections to him. What does that say? I can't see that, Melinda.
93.
Yeah,
He's
that's what I said, 93. So since I was going to be in Palo Alto to visit my son, I thought, here's a chance to meet him while he's still alive. And I have a couple connections to him, and I was able to arrange that and spend 45 minutes with him. It was really a great experience. And I thought, well, I'm going to read one of his books I haven't read before I meet him. And this is the book I read, which I'm recommending to people, called Mama and the Meaning of Life. And it has two chapters, but one in particular that are all about patients who don't open up and don't reveal anything and don't show themselves. And then at some point, they do open up. And you find that there's just the most amazing inner life going on within them once you have access to it. And I highly recommend you get hold of this book, which you could probably get at the library or through interlibrary loan, and read the chapter called Double Exposure. It's one of the most amazing stories I've ever read about working with a patient and who ends up, I'm giving away the key, but who opens up about herself after not doing so at all for the early period of therapy. So I wanted to underline that point about this is the main thing I wanted to get at about when we study biographical subjects, we get at these incredible inner lives of them. That's what enables us to do good psychobiography. And the same thing is true for us when we do psychotherapy, that to some extent, getting access to that inner life, as Yalom's character is able to do in that story of his, is part of what makes psychotherapy work.
You find it worthwhile to go back to the ego psychology to figure out how they developed as a child, where the
I do have an interest in the child development. Yes, I definitely believe the child is well, that's where you become who you are. And it's so amazing when you see these connections in the adult to what happened then, and often helps someone understand their problems better when they see where they came from. So yes, I do find that useful to learn about somebody's life. You have to start out focusing on the problems that bring them to therapy, but usually looking at earlier life is valuable too in a long-term therapy.
what stages they get caught in.
That happens, yes.
I do too. Can you tell us about your book a little more? You kind of glossed over it.
Well, I gave you some of the themes of the book.
Yeah.
I mean, the book is about psychobiography and what's involved in doing psychobiography well rather than poorly. For example, learning about narrative identity, having a relationship with the person you're writing about where you are not condemning them or idealizing them. So I look at different chapters of these different aspects of doing psychobiography. So it might seem like a technical book that's about doing psychobiography and how it can be done well rather than poorly. But I really do think it's readable. If anybody would like to read the book without buying it, email me. Bryn can tell you how, and I'll send you a PDF of the book. I'm not in the, I feel the book's overpriced, and even though I could give people, there is a discount, which I could let you know about, it's still too expensive, and I'm glad to give people a copy of the book in a PDF. And one of the best pieces of praise I got was from my sister, where she said, I decided to read your book, and I was worried that it would be too technical, and she said it was a delightful reading because it's all about these anecdotes that illustrate the different points, like about Edith Wharton and her dream, and Hemingway and the hair on his chest, the hair on his chest. The whole book is these different stories that illustrate the different points about biographies. And there's so many fascinating people. Bryn mentioned some of them, whom I talk about.
So you have it right there, folks, from Jim's sister, no less an authority than your own sister. Now, I would recommend that if this talk has interested you at all, to go ahead and purchase the book. It's a terrific read. And Jim, we're really grateful that you've shared this hour and a half with us tonight on Colleagues and Conversations. Your generous and affectionate look at both the authors and their subjects. I think you are the embodiment of the principles that you use to approach the subject itself. Very generous, very, well, humanistic in the best sense of the word. So thank you so much again, and I look forward to hearing more.
Hey, thank you.
Good night now.